Hello, good morning. My name is Emil Underberg. I'm in the forest not far from Xanten in the area of the very west of Germany, close to the Dutch border and just about 2 kilometers away from the River Rhine before it flows into the Netherlands. I'm here to explain you something about tree vegetation, water cycles and climate, because in the moment we are on the best way to destroy our livelihood and the abilities to live on this planet, and as well the planet itself and all life on the surface of the planet. This forest here is quite old, and I will explain to you what biodiversity is doing for stability and productivity of ecosystems, and how agroforestry systems of high diversity can be a solution to feed ecosystems and mankind. We are talking about the different functions the biosphere had in the past, and how it works in the moment, and how it is dysfunctional in this situation, and how we can change it to get it back into function. In ecosystems, systems never end. All systems are working in cycles. So the end of life here of a dead tree is the life of other organisms who live from the dead tree. So the question is, what do we do to feed the biosphere, to feed the ecosystem, and to feed humans? And how do we close the cycles of the nutrition of humans? And how do we close the cycles of nutrition of the biosphere? If we burn all natural material, then the only thing which is left is the minerals and trace elements, the ash for nutrition. But there is nothing we feed the bacteria with which break down the material and give new life to new organisms. We are here in this forest because in the past most of the vegetation on the planet looked in our climate areas like this. I want to explain that these different functions can be seen from a very different perspective, especially in the topic of climate, because if you imagine the surface of a big tree is bigger than 2 hectares, which are 20,000 square meters. And if water evaporates and condenses, with the evaporation, it expands with a factor of almost 2,000. So this water evaporation has a very strong cooling effect, and most of you have experienced this when you have a little rain shower. Usually after that the temperature drops by about 10 degrees Celsius. We are in this forest with all these kind of old trees, which are not very old but quite with some years, and this forest shows that life is at the surface between the air and the ground, and life starts several meters, 20, 30, 50 meters into the sky, and life goes down into the ground with all the roots. We are here to explain that if we bend this ecosystem a little bit into the direction of the use for human beings, and if we give this livelihood, as you can see here, the soil the chance to function also as an absorbance for nitrogen, for oxygen, and for water. Then this soil has the ability to pick up water, nutrition, and oxygen. And as you can see here on top, it starts very soft with a lot of air and very little material, minerals and trace elements, which are digested by small organisms. And you have to imagine in one spoon or one handful of soil, there are more bacteria in my hand now than humans on the planet. Our forefathers, about 10, 12, maybe 15,000 years ago, used the forest as their main resource of nutrition. And they used this source of nutrition in the past and to eat mainly nuts and mushrooms, not these kinds here, as you can see on the tree. They used it to eat fruits. And when they started to understand that the forest has all kinds of things you can eat, they eated all kinds of nuts and fruits, and they also seeded. So they looked into the sky and looked where the forest was open to extra light. They brought at that point a seed into the soil, and then when they brought the seed into the soil, they made sure that this specific seed would help them to feed them. So far as we know, more than 60% of the deserts on this planet are man-made and without bad intention. The way we do modern agriculture for the last 10,000 years is a way where we use mainly annual plants like grain, rice, maize, potatoes, and manioc. Manioc is the only one which isn't annual. And our forefathers, before these 10, 12, 15,000 years, used food from perennial plants, trees like nut trees and fruit trees, and funguses and all kind of small root vegetables. And they were eating them to feed them, and we can do that in the future again. Of course, it will change our nutrition, but in Central Europe, about the last 30 years, people started to eat sushi, and 30 years ago, nobody was eating sushi. About 50, 70 years ago, in Northern Europe, nobody was eating pizza. 250, 300 years ago, nobody was eating potatoes or tomatoes. So the typical English hot potato, the typical English hot tomato for breakfast is nothing which has a very long tradition if you see it in the context of mankind history. Most of our vegetables, most of our food we eat now is a development of the last centuries or the last even decades. So it's nothing which is dramatically old with a very old history. So the point is, if we now create ecosystems which are close to the natural function, so that the natural cycles, like with these trees and these fungus, are eaten by bacteria up, and there's a new building of soil done by that. And at the same time, we close the nutritional cycles of humans so that we don't run into a very big crisis for phosphates in the next decades, which all scientists say will be more dramatic than the run out of fossil resources like oil. In the future, we will have to close the cycles starting today. And we have to start to close these cycles today because fruit trees and nut trees, all different kind of level of plants down, can feed mankind easily around the globe if we green the deserts, if we bring vegetation back into the landscape. So if we bring this vegetation back into the landscape, and we do that very smart, then we have the chance that this smart way of bringing vegetation into landscape again, by harvesting water, making 20 to 30 centimeters high dams, so that the water, when it rains, maybe just in the deserts every 2 or 3 years, just doesn't run away, and is locally building up the water table in the ground, but also is the first stimulants to get vegetation grow. And we combine these plants with communication on the same level of treatment of the local population, communicating with them as fair partners, learning from them, being willing to learn from them, and telling them about what we know and sharing this. Then we have a chance, by introducing medicinal plants the local population knows, which are beneficial to their health and to the health of their goats and sheep. They have a very strong interest to make sure that these goats and sheep don't eat up after being successful at the beginning of bringing this vegetation back in by eating everything to nothing. So if we bring in as an initial planting these medicinal plants, and we communicate with the people, and we show that our work is valuable for them, also economical and valuable to their health and valuable to their animals, then we show that we take their dreams and fears very serious. If we do that and we green the 60% of the deserts, which are man-made, in the next few years, till the year 2030, where mankind in 193 countries want to achieve the 17 sustainability goals to the year 2030, if we do that in the next 10 years, in the most difficult countries on the planet, where there is civil war, where there is most desertification, where there is most destruction of ecosystems or social systems or economical systems, then we have a good chance that these good examples stimulate people to do in easier countries the same, because usually if the good example from the more difficult country is seen, everybody feels inspired in an easier country to do the same. So to come back, if we bend these natural ecosystems by enlarging the amount of nuts like walnuts and hazelnuts, like chestnuts or oaks with no bitterness in the acorns or reduced bitterness of acorns, and we combine it with fruit trees and all kinds of vegetables in agroforestry systems of high diversity, then the high diversity of plants bring productivity and stability, because the high diversity of plants bring a high diversity of microorganisms in the soil, and this high diversity of life in the soil brings a high diversity of pee and poo of these bacteria, and this high diversity of pee and poo brings a high diversity of nutrition, and this high diversity of nutrition makes it very, very easy for all kinds of plants to take up the nutrition the plants need. So we call this form of nutrition as a metaphor, cafeteria style. So you have a very, very wide range of nutrition you can choose, and you can pick up the nutrition you feel fits to you best. And if the plants have this ability, this helps the plants to be optimum in their nutrition, and it helps them as well to increase the stability of the ecosystem and also the productivity of this ecosystem. So if at the same time, besides the feeding of humans with all kind of human need plants, we add to the ecosystem besides nut trees, fruit trees and other food and trees, food plants, the plants which are beneficial for the ecosystems, like nitrogen fixing trees like black locust or like alder or like aleagnus. Then if we add these plants to the ecosystems which also fix nitrogen as perennial plants, with once planting these trees into the ecosystem, we don't have to think of closing the nutritional cycles also in the sense of nitrogen fixing and nitrogen supply for the ecosystem. If we at the same time also add plants which are good for the fungus in the soil, like mycorrhiza, if we add plants which are beneficial for insects, if we add plants which are beneficial for birds and other species in the ecosystem, we feed the ecosystem and we feed humans at the same time. I want to finish my presentation with a short summary. 10,000 years ago, humans were using for many, many hundreds, thousands of years the forest, which was covering the surface for human consumption. But mankind were not understanding the importance of tree vegetation, like here, for the ecosystem and for the climate. Now, as we understand water cycles, tree vegetation, biodiversity for the climate, different for stability and productivity of ecosystems, for productivity and stability of ecosystems also to human use. Now we understand things different, and it's time to act to bring multifunctional agroforestry systems into the vegetation and into areas where the vegetation is destroyed. And if you imagine, on these soils here, we had in the past a meter and a half, 2 meters of surface. And if you think, the air starts up there to not only longer be just air. So the minerals and trace elements which are brought up here are the minerals and trace elements which are brought up here to build this tree with the leaves, with the absorption of sunlight, bringing nutrition into the ground, feeding the organisms in the soil. And at the same time, these minerals and trace elements are mobilized by these bacteria in the soil so that they can be taken up by the plants. So the air starts very deep down in the soil by bringing air into the soil by the roots, by the bacteria who live together with the plants, and the ground and the minerals and trace elements in the ground are pushed into the air by the vegetation. So the whole livelihood is starting at the top of the trees, and the livelihood mainly ends, not totally, but mainly ends at the end, very deep down, 20, 30 meters down into the ground where the roots end of the trees. And if we take care of the total system called nature and take care of the needs of human at the same time, and we stimulate the diversity as much as we can all together, then we can live in harmony. And scientists from the 80s already were giving the vision that it would be without any difficulty, without having any difficulty to have nature protected areas, to be able with these functional, multifunctional, multi-level, multi-diverse ecosystems to feed mankind 30, 35 billion people. Thank you for your attention.